So as I mentioned this morning when we were on having the discussions on the panel, I am from the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, CDEMA. I work with the coordinating unit of CDEMA. And, CDEMA is a system that represents 20 participating states from the Caribbean that are small island developing states, and low-lying coastal states in the case of Guyana, Suriname, Belize. Yes. So today we're going to try to discuss a little bit on practical tools, but I have a caveat. I'm going to talk a little bit about the enabling environment as well, and I'll try not to go on for too long. Right. So I think to set the context, I think we should all be familiar with some of the antecedents around what we're talking about in terms of disaster risk exposure and so on for Latin America and the Caribbean. But in the case of the Caribbean, a part of the Latin American Caribbean region, the effects are quite disproportionate. So just to note that, 70% of the disasters in Caribbean region are hydromet. Wanted to mention that. And I mentioned the socioeconomic and geophysical aspects of the Caribbean islands that make them more vulnerable. Small island developing states, low-lying coastal states, capacity issues, and challenges regarding fiscal, just the fiscal space. I mentioned disproportionate impacts. I hope I can get this to work. Okay, I had a little video there that should, I don't know if you're able to click on that for me. All right, it's fine. Right, so in Latin America and the Caribbean as a sub-region of that region is about 60 population. We know the Caribbean islands are small in terms of size and population, but the disaster impact is about 60%. That's what we were really alluding to, and quite a large proportion of the impacts I mentioned, hydromet, are storm related to cyclones. So I think we've established that integrated multi-hazard early warning systems are quite important in this context because it saves lives and livelihoods. To continue on the regional context and why we're here talking about this is, if you look carefully, based on what I said, you look at Latin America and the Caribbean on this chart to the left, we're looking at the region broken down into sub-regions, Central America, South America, and the Caribbean, and you can see the disproportionate nature of the impacts to the Caribbean states. And if you look at the exposure to tropical cyclones on the right, you will see that the most exposed countries, most of them are Caribbean states, and most of them are CDEMA participating states. Just about three of them there are not CDEMA participating states. So I just wanted to mention there. Not sure my presentation is seems like it's having some technical issues. Right. So I just wanted to mention why we're here talking about multi-hazard early warning states for CDEMA, multi-hazard early warning systems for CDEMA participating states. And who we're talking about, when I stand here and talk about CDEMA participating states, I think some of my text is missing from here, but CDEMA comprises 20 states, as I mentioned. We have Anguilla, Antigua, Barbuda, Cayman Islands, the Commonwealth of Bahamas, Barbados, Belize, Commonwealth of Dominica, Trinidad and Tobago. They're in alphabetical order, so I'm hoping I didn't Dominica, I mentioned, Guyana, Suriname, uh, Grenada, I mentioned. You can check our website. I'm losing track of which ones are missing. Right, sorry about that. So I'm gonna move right into the talking about what are some of the practical tools we use in relation to multi-hazard or early warning systems, given the context that was set regarding and the exposure of Caribbean states of CDEMA participating. All right. I'm just gonna deliberate on two simple tools, and then I'll talk to you a little bit on some of the enabling frameworks that we talked about during the panel discussion this morning. One of the tools I mentioned, is that me? Or is it something? Okay. Right. So while they're doing that, I'll try to, to continue. Right. I mentioned that CDEMA is focused on comprehensive disaster management, and we're talking about multi-hazard early warning systems. So we're talking about not just the scientific elements and the technology associated with the alerts, the warnings, and so on, and even risk information. We're also talking about the elements that relate to preparedness and response, right? And so CDEMA, although we work across, because there are elements of all the pillars that relate more to the disaster management side, CDEMA is especially concerned, and my department specifically, preparedness and response, disaster risk information as well. Some of the tools that I'll talk about are focused on that, right? One practical tool was a result of some South-South cooperation with Cuba. We took a look at some of, in fact, we just had a mission to Cuba last week as well to examine some of the tools that can be shared across, the region. And one of the things that was done a few years ago was the sharing of what Cuba calls a SAT toolbox. The SAT toolbox The SAT toolbox is an early warning systems toolbox that's more community focused, that includes a number of tools, so a number of documents and guidelines that are supposed to help the countries to pull together and work across some key elements of the multi-hazard early warning systems value chain in terms of disaster risk knowledge I mentioned, and so on. So in terms of risk knowledge, this tool, as you can see in the image here, we have some of the Cuban counterparts working with, in this case, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, to really examine their systems, especially at the local level, the community level, and see what tools would be most applicable and how they can be adopted. So the tools included tools on risk knowledge that outline the methodologies that can be used to assess and understand the various risks, especially natural hazards like hurricanes and flooding, and in the case of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, landslides especially, and volcanic activity. Also, focus on monitoring and warning systems, tools for up and improving monitoring systems, including volunteer observation tools. And I'm not sure why my slides are a bit cut off. Right. Dissemination and communication tools were also incorporated there, and they did work not just with the disaster office, but also through the partnership with services and community-led organizations. The tools also focuses on the communication elements, especially the last mile communication elements, where we look at how the community is receiving the messages, what are and who are the key players at the community level to help with the dissemination of the messages and in what format, using what medium. So social media, local radios, and so on for community alerts. Also included resources and guidance on how to develop and strengthen community response capabilities, including preparedness plans and plans for emergency shelter and the activation of emergency shelters. So that's bringing together some of the key elements, not just to say what the hazards are, natural hazards in terms of understanding the risk and methodologies for understanding the risks, but how to get the alerts and the information out there into at the last mile, and also how to include key response elements to save lives, as in activating plans, opening shelters, and so on. So these were delivered to a few countries: St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Dominica, and I think there was another, the Dominican Republic. I didn't mention them because they're not a CDEMA participating state. Another practical tool that we have developed, and keeping in mind CDEMA is a regional organization, so again, we try to focus on how we can equip the countries with tools to help them to make those connections where the gaps exist between, in this case, national Met services and national disaster offices. So what we did is, over a period where we tested some checklists and so on to see what the gaps are in the countries. After that, we were able to develop a model standard operating procedure that really guides the Met services and the disaster offices on how to, in a step-by-step way, share information on hazardous events. What are the steps in terms of issuing alerts between the two? What are the roles and responsibilities of the disaster offices in this regard? And how to provide situation updates and disseminate those alerts and warnings. This SOP was developed in 4 pilot countries: Antigua and Barbuda, Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, and Jamaica. I believe Jamaica or the Bahamas. Yes, the Bahamas. Right. And those countries were selected because in the CDEMA system, we have broken the region up into subregions. So those, with the exception of Bahamas, represents the focal points across the region, the focal points for each subregion. And some of them, in the case of Antigua and Barbuda, work with other islands to provide hydromet services, provide a technical services to other islands within their subregion. So this was a key tool that was implemented, and now we're at the point where we're looking to go back to the countries and see how this SOP is being implemented, see what are the elements of it that may need updating, and how we can improve the operationalization of the SOPs. One last practical tool that I will mention is the checklist. We mentioned this briefly when we spoke with our colleague from Belize regarding the process for establishing a multi-hazard early warning system. I mentioned that within the CDEMA system, the countries, we developed a checklist based on an existing that was developed by WMO, and we tailored it with partnership from UNDP to the Caribbean region. So for each pillar, as you can see there, disaster risk knowledge, detection, monitoring, analysis, warning, and response, we went through a series of questions. So basically indicators that help the country to assess what are the strengths and weaknesses in each pillar. And this is done not just with disaster offices, but also with Met services, so that we have a comprehensive and robust understanding across the chain of where we are and what are the key issues. And there you can see there are a number of questions, indicators, so to speak, that help us to understand the situation per country. So for Belize, you're in this process right now. I'm not sure if you're already finished with your checklist, but you're in this process. And what this checklist allows us to do, of course, as I mentioned, is to then develop a report detailing what the strengths and weaknesses are and the opportunities, as well as then develop a roadmap with the country. Of course, the Met services will say, well, these are the particular challenges that we have with monitoring, detection, forecasting, and so on. This is what we need. This is the equipment. These are the systems. These are the software, and so on. And that should be documented in their plan, which we try as far as possible to cost. So if we want a sense of, what are some of the gaps in these countries, the plans are a good place to start. And what were their particular activities, what were their particular plans for equipment that they needed to purchase, what are their particular priorities for systems that need to be put in place, and so on, right? So moving on from the tools, at the CDEMA level, we understand that the tools are tools that can make a difference, but we require the offices, the players on the ground require an enabling environment to be able to implement the tools, to be able to use the tools. And when you would have, for example, in the case of the checklist, when you would have developed your action plan, there needs to be some clear framework priorities that allow you to say to your minister, to your permanent secretary, that this is where we're pulling the resources from. This is why this is a priority, or that this is what the overall national strategic level guidance says. And I mentioned these this morning. CDEMA, with the participating states and our partners, did work on a number of model documents, model tools that help to create that environment to allow them to apply the practical tools that we talked about. The model legislation, which was updated to include an annex on early warning systems, as you see there. A model policy, well, policy, we believe, is a starting point as it guides the legislation. The policy addresses the 4 pillars, and this policy was developed after having tested and applied the checklist in pilot countries. So we had a fair understanding across the 20 participating states of what some of the main challenges were. So the policy was developed based on that, and the gaps that were identified and approved by those participating states at 2 levels. A level where the disaster offices and our regional would have taken a look at it and said, well, yes, this is what we believe will work. It's not. And then at the ministerial level, where ministers has to review and approve, right? So in terms of the enabling environment, we talked about policy and legislation, which form a key part of the framework to help the countries. But we know from this morning, we said that there are quite a lot of our participating states who, despite the model documents being there, have not yet adopted the documents, have not yet applied them nationally. Uh, to this end and beyond, we have some key able to, pull things together. One, Certium did mention this morning as well. Um, and our CDM, our Comprehensive Disaster Management Strategy. This body is there to help to ensure that the projects and the different partners that are entering the space are working in alignment with what the regional approach, the regional direction is, and that the resource mobilization are being used in a manner that aligns with that. We also have the early warning information systems across climate timescales consortium that is led by CIMH, the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology. This is another multidisciplinary, multi-stakeholder platform that really is more focused on the climate services element of it and ensuring that the climate services elements are brought together to help guide the countries in terms of planning and decision making for multi-hazard early warning systems. Thank you. Right, so there we talked about what are the issues in the region, why is it so important? We talked about practical tools, which is essentially was supposed to be the focus of the presentation, but I hijacked it a bit. Talked about three practical tools. The SAT, the Early Warning Systems Toolbox, that's especially localized in its focus and offers several tools and methodologies. We also talked about the enabling environment required to make these things happen and to support the agencies responsible for leading. And we talked about governance arrangements that also form part of the enabling environment that help to monitor and guide all of the partners working in the space in alignment with one regional approach and one regional direction. I want to mention, as part of the enabling environment and the framework, that the Caribbean region, from a comprehensive disaster management standpoint, focuses on multi-hazard early warning systems within the context of the comprehensive disaster risk management strategy, the Comprehensive Disaster Management Strategy and Results Framework 2014 to 2030. And now this strategy has a specific priority area for multi-hazard early warning system, but it aligns with the Caribbean Resilience Pathway. It aligns with the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, and in so doing, the key tenets of the early warning systems for all initiative, and is focused on all four of the multi-hazard early warning systems pillars. So saying that to say that we are working within a specific framework that's designed for the Caribbean that captures the work of all of the partners and helps us to determine what tools, what approaches, and so on, what practical tools can fit into the vision we have for the region in terms of multi-hazard early warning systems. So I think I'll stop there.